Chris at A to B here. We're going to finish the tear down on the Cadillac engine here to see what we'll get to see what the actual damage is. But I went around, and as you can see, I knocked the core plugs out of it. Yes, they're core plugs, not freeze plugs. They won't come out if they freeze. It'll just still bust the block. But something that these 70s engines, a lot of them had, that GM especially was really bad about. It's kind of hard to see. Let me see if I can get some light. See all the junk in the bottom of that core plug hole? A little bit there. That one's pretty clean. But this back one's the worst, and they are always bad, almost always, because the foundry did not get all of the casting sand out of these blocks. And this was pretty much universal for all GM engines. That's years of compacted casting sand mixed with antifreeze. It's not actually rust because it doesn't have the acidic smell to it, but the block is all packed full of it back here in the corner. I can feel it back there. I can't get any of it out, but that's what contributes to a lot of these older engines overheating, is if they've never been torn down and apart and cleaned out in a hot tank, a lot of these blocks are still full of casting sand. So let's go ahead and start tearing it down. One thing I found interesting that most GM engines don't have, and of this era, I don't know why it's this way. I don't think this engine's ever been apart, but these rods are already matched. There's number 7, there's number 5. They've already been stamped with the cylinder numbers on them, which is odd because this engine doesn't really look to have been apart, so apparently that must have been something Cadillac did on the assembly line. The main caps are also pinpoint drilled for their location. That one you can't see, it's got dirt on it, but there's 1 and 2 and 3, 4, and then number 5 cap is special, so you can tell. Can't mix that one up. One good idea when you're tearing one down, if you've got one with like this has a main bolt in an odd spot for the oil pump pickup, I stamped that cap with an S for stud, so I remember where the stud goes. So anyway, number 8 here, clear at the back, is, yeah, it's kind of hard to tell now. I've turned it over. The spun rod bearing must be, there we go. So let's take it apart and we'll find out what's wrong. Well, I already know what's wrong, but we'll find out how bad it is. How about that? Rod bearing is definitely spun. That rod's not going to have any bearing crush anymore. But it doesn't appear to be blue. So hopefully we can have these rods resized. Oh yeah, there's a little bit of bearing left in there. That little bitty piece of bearing there. Let me get some protectors on there. Don't want the rod bolts to scratch the crank, even though the crank's already tore up, but we don't need to tear it up any worse than it is. And keep in mind, everything I'm doing here, these pistons aren't being used again. So I'm not worried about what I might do to tear up the pistons. There's the other side of the rod. Get the camera to focus. Not as bad as I have seen, and like I said, this side's not blue either, so we might be okay. These pistons have a ton of scuffing. Kind of hard to see in the. They have a ton of scuffing. This is from overheating. So we will match this cap and rod back up, put the nuts back on it, and put it over here on the parts table. See if we can get what's left of this bearing off of here. Oh, hey, there's still 2 pieces of bearing in there. Come on. There we go. They're just about paper thin. This is what was causing all the racket. What's odd is this bearing doesn't look it's not looking like it was actually down to the copper layer before it spun. So a lot of times what happens if these engines get really hot, the bearing crush will be lost and they can spin the bearings in the rods or the mains. Well, now let's pull off number 7 next to it and we'll see how the journal compares side by side. This one's definitely tighter, but I expect to find this one not in real hot shape. Yeah, this one was starting to spin. This bearing had spun too. Number 7 had spun. That dark spot, that's where it's starting to, it was turning. And the bearing split's no longer in the right place. I'm gonna have to turn this crank back just a little bit. Oops, wrong one. Need to go this way. Yeah, we can see this bearing is just about welded together. Number 7 was spun too. The bearing's not as thin, but it's close. I'll show you. I'll bring you guys over here in a second. Once I get this rod out of here, we got a pretty good step in the rod journal on the crank. So let me show you. Once again, the pistons are, And it's hard to tell. This is really rough when you cross it right there. This engine really doesn't look like it had that much wear in it prior to all this happening, because you can still see the machining marks in the sides of the pistons going that way, but you can see all the scuffing. And that wrist pin's just about seized in that one too, because you can just barely turn that piston. So I will bring you over here and show you the step in the journal. You can see this step right here in this journal. I'll get the caliper out and we'll measure the difference in it. Neither one of those journals, neither side of that journal is in good shape, but number 8 journal measures 2.489. Number 7 measures 2.490. So we've got a few thousandths cut off of that number 8. Well, let's move on to number 6. We'll see what number 6 looks like. Measure one. We'll look at one that's not loose, doesn't feel weird, end plays good on it, but I bet we'll find more surprises before we're done. Oof. The bearing's still in that shell. This one's still got its crush. Not much, but it's got a little bit of it. This is from severe lack of lubrication, either from overheating or, remember the sandblasted valve covers? This could also be contaminants going through the oil. See if we can see. It's a GM 400 series bearing. M400 series. Heh. It's not marked with a size, surprisingly enough. Trying to get it to focus on the. It's a GM M400 series bearing, and there's the part number, but I don't have a size marking, which is unusual. Number 6 piston's also not in as bad a shape either. Top side of that bearing is just about as bad. About the same wear pattern on it. Flaking. I would say this engine was probably compromised from contaminants from the valve cover cleaning, but then the overheating is what finished it off. farther, but my trick for turning it is not working as well since we're getting that notch down in the engine stand. Should be enough. This engine turns really hard too, which finding pistons with tight pins in them, that's not helping. Yep, same type of damage in that bearing too. Yeah, this one's got the same type of damage in the bearings, and this one was starting to loosen up the dark spots and stuff. And this piston's tight, and the wrist pin on this piston's tight too. These have pressed pins. They should float pretty good in the rods, but or float pretty good in the piston, but they do not. I don't have a crank bolt to be able to turn this crankshaft with because this engine doesn't have a crank bolt in the end of it. They don't need, Cadillac didn't use a crank bolt in it. So I'm having to get kind of creative. It's got a hole threaded in the end of the crank, but I cannot. I'm gonna have to find a bolt to fit that when we put it back together. I don't have any 1/2-inch fine thread bolts or anything. Yeah, that bearing spun too. Number 4's got a spun bearing as the bearing's turned. Let me show you where the split line is. It's kind of hard to see without the light, but that real faint line going across there, those are those 2 divots, those are the bearing keys. So it spun number 4 too. I can't believe this thing didn't make more noise than it did. These pistons are coming out pretty good because it's got a fair amount of ridge at the top of the cylinder. And that wrist pin on that one's tight too. Yeah, judging by the way this thing's turning over pretty hard by hand, I would say this engine is on the verge of locking up. Yeah, and that one spun also. Number 3 is also spun. Seems to be a theme. I hope we don't find any spun main bearings, 'cause that's a bad day. I can't even hardly move that. That's about all I can do to move it. Let's measure that rod journal up there. And let's measure one here that wasn't spun. Man, remember, even the ones that weren't spun are not in good shape. Yeah, I can't see it right now. My eyes are getting too old to see it down there in the dark. And this engine's still turning tight and only has 2 pistons left in it. Well, that one wasn't spun. Pretty bad looking though. You can tell this one wasn't spun because the bearing key right there is still intact, still sticking out. So it'll fit into the groove here in the cap. And that crank journal there is the worst looking one, and it didn't have a spun bearing on it. Interesting. These old engines, you never know what you're going to find when you tear them down. Especially interesting damage. Good thing I don't need them anymore. Good thing it's not made out of glass. None of the rings in this thing are stuck. Can't believe as bad as that bearing looks that it wasn't spun. I'll show you that. I'll show you that rod journal when I get this other one out. That one, for having a non-spun bearing, is in the worst shape. Man, this thing is still hard to turn. Some of this oil off my hands. That one's spun. Number one is spun. I know this thing sounded bad, but I didn't expect to find this much damage. Man, that one I can't. I'm struggling to move that one. Yeah, them bearings were spun on number one. It looked like crap too. At least the crank turns pretty easy. That number one and two rod journal is pretty severely tore up. Three and four are grooved a little. 5 and 6, actually, for as bad as those bearings looked, 5 and 6, rod journal's actually not horrible. Nothing there will catch your hand. Let's measure the best rod journal in the whole thing. Get out of the fillet. Yeah, we're at about 2.5, 2.499 versus our severely spun one at 2.482. So we've already, this crank's gonna have to go at least 20 under to fix it, at least on the rods. Well, let's pull the main caps and hope we don't find anything else worse. First thing I want to do though is I want to check to see what the end play feels like. End play feels good. End play is not horrible. Maybe a little on the loose side. Just judging by feeling it, it's probably got 7 or 8 thousandths end play. I don't know what the spec is yet. I haven't looked. Looks like so far all of the main bolts are the same size. Not the only one different being the one with the stud on it. But other than that, they're all the same. Let's knock these caps loose and see what we got. I'll bring you all along and we'll pull them off and see them together. Well, that one knocked loose. Bearing's at least not spun. Not in good shape. It's definitely into the lead and it was starting to come loose. Yeah, our end plays too much. You can tell where that was digging into the edge of that bearing. Yep, that one too. Phooey. Let me go grab a screwdriver and see if I can pull that bearing shell out of there. That main number 2 main may be spun. Oh, no, it's not, but oh boy, is it bad. Yikes. It was definitely spreading the metal out. You can tell, see how the bearing material is like melted out at the edge where that sucker was hot. Put these caps over here so I don't lose them. I don't knock them off. I don't want to tear them up. Yeesh. There's our thrust bearing. Thrust is taken on number 3. The actual thrust surfaces of the bearing aren't bad. Little dug in back here, but given the rest of the damage, it's kind of to be expected, I guess. You get a pry bar, pry this bearing out of there, and get this shell out of there. And that is a flanged bearing to take up the thrust. And at least it wasn't spun. Let's see what number 4 looks like. Same story, melted bearing, everything melted out from the edges, but at least not spun. That's good. These bearings have all been hot too because they're sprung in when I take them out. You can tell they've been hot because they're actually shrunk. Try and get that, see where that doesn't even, they're sprung and shrunk in. They don't even fit the cap anymore. This thing wouldn't run too much longer without spinning a main bearing. Well, still don't turn the easiest, but see if I can get this thing up out of here. Ugh. Number 2 main bearing, or main journal's grooved pretty bad. Number 1's not bad. Number 3's got a little bit. Number 4's a little rough too. Number 5's not bad. It's unusual is the upper main shells, they're clear down to the copper Typically the upper main bearing shells don't really wear. I mean, that one's got contaminant situation, but not bad. Number 5's pretty rough too. It was definitely transferring metal. I mean, it looks bad on camera, but man, it even feels rough. So. You can see the number 2 main's pretty rough right there, so. Well, I'm gonna go ahead and get the rest of this block cleaned out, get the cam bearings knocked out of it. The cam bearings from looking down the bores actually look pretty good. So we'll get it to the machine shop hopefully this week, and we'll see what they tell us. Just on my rough measurements with a caliper, we're probably going to have to go at least 20 thousandths under on the crank to make it work again. And I'm going to have to call and see what kind of undersized bearings are available and make sure we can get 20 or 30 under bearings. So if we can't, we may be looking for a core engine for this situation. So anyway, this is Chris at A to B Automotive. Like and subscribe. Thanks.